Alright, so the TWAB came out earlier than expected because of Thanksgiving coming next week, and this is less of a balance patch, in my opinion, and more of a replacement of the scale that is used. This, I think, is the advent of what we would consider to be the Destiny 3 experience, moving into the changes that are being talked about in this balance patch. And what's kind of interesting is that there's nothing necessarily groundbreakingly new, in that it's not any new features being added, but how they are able to define the sandbox is evolving. In the 30th anniversary, we've changed the way ability cooldowns work. Up until now, cooldowns across individual ability types, grenade, melee, class, and super, have generally been identical between all abilities of the same type. For example, all the grenades in today's Destiny 2 share the same cooldown time, with the exception of stasis grenades. This shared cooldown means that all grenades need to have roughly the same power output because they have the same time cost. The 30th anniversary, we've made a change that allows us to tune the cooldown of each ability separately. This gives us a new knob to turn when balancing abilities that are too powerful or not powerful enough. Now that we have this new system in place, we've done a cooldown tuning pass of all the subclass abilities in-game, tuning each ability's cooldown time against its power output. We've also tuned ability power outputs and assigned cooldown times accordingly. The best example of this might be the Flux Grenade. Take a look. Increased base cooldown from 82 seconds to 182 seconds. Increased attached detonation damage from 150 to 250, which is a one-shot kill on PvP. Increased damage versus PvE combatants by 15% on top of base damage increase. Removed projectile tracking. Added a small amount of aim assist. Increased throw speed by 117%. Now sticks to all surfaces. As you can see, the Flux Grenade now has a very long cooldown, but it is a one-shot kill on PvP if you manage to land it. It also hits harder in PvE. As a reminder, the Flux Grenade is currently only available to Hunter Arcstriders. The opposite of this example, they reduced the efficacy of the Firebolt Grenade, but made it so that you could spam it more often, right? Reduced base cooldown from 82 to 64, reduced damage per bolt, increased damage versus PvE combatants. These kinds of varied cooldowns and power outputs should make the game feel more dynamic and give more depth to build crafting. To make build crafting around cooldowns easier, you'll now be able to see the base cooldown times of your abilities when selecting them on the subclass screen. On the character screen, you'll see the actual cooldown time of your abilities as they're affected by your equipped ability and armor stats. The base cooldown time is actually the cooldown time at tier 3 of the relevant armor stat. Base cooldown is measured from 3. This is because the system technically penalizes you for tanking your stats below 3, in which case your cooldown would be longer than base. They're looking into updating this to be more intuitive in a future release. Cooldown times for class abilities are not currently displayed due to a technical issue. We plan to fix this in a future release. We've been calling this variable ability cooldown system, and we think it's the beginning of a big change for the Destiny 2 sandbox. It's a foundational change in preparation to move the light subclasses over to the Subclass 3.0 system that Stasis currently uses. For the 30th anniversary, we're using it to change the cooldown of nearly every ability in-game. One of our design goals this year was to reduce the amount of ability spam in the Crucible and to put the focus back on gunplay. To this end, we've made ability cooldown times longer on average than they were before. We don't want the PvE experience to suffer for the sake of PvP balance though, so we've tried to compensate where possible. For example, we increased all grenade damage versus PvE combatants by 15% or more, which should make grenades feel like bigger power moments than they do in today's game. Melee ability cooldowns haven't been increased quite as much as grenade cooldowns, and some of the less aggressive melee attacks have lower cooldowns than before. Class ability cooldowns also have generally increased, but changes vary depending on which ability is equipped. We're excited to see how these changes feel once they hit the live game, and we'll be monitoring and adjusting accordingly in future releases. Since Destiny's launch in 2014, super energy gain has been almost entirely passive. Your intellect stat dictates how quickly your super regenerates, with a few other elements like orbs of power, armor, and weapon perks, defeating targets as active sources. This system worked well for a long time, but has issues that have grown more obvious as the game has evolved and overall player skill, especially skill in evaluating how to play around their character build, has increased. In high-stakes game modes like Trials of Osiris or Survival, where each life is precious, passive play becomes more common as players sit back and wait for their supers to close out a tied game. In general, we want the most efficient way to gain super energy to be actively engaging in combat. That doesn't mean you need to win every fight, but we want you to try. To get us closer to that goal, we're making a big change to this system. Super Regeneration will still have a passive component scaled by your intellect stat, but at a significantly reduced rate. On top of your passive regeneration, you will also gain super energy by dealing and taking damage to or from opponents. Here are a few key goals for the new system. In PvE, Super uptime should be relatively unchanged from the live game, if not slightly higher. We're pretty happy with the frequency of supers in most PvE content and don't want to make big changes right now on that front. Everybody should get at least one super in a 6v6 match that goes to score or time limit as long as they engage in regular combat. Expression of power through using your awesome space magic is a core part of what makes Destiny special, and we're not looking to change that. We think the cadence of supers in 6v6 modes is slightly too high. We don't expect a dramatic change in super uptime for most players in playlists like Control or Iron Banner as a result of these changes. Supers should be less frequent in 3v3 modes than in the live game, where 2 supers per match is fairly regular occurrence. These modes are about expression of player skill. We want that skill to be primarily about team coordination, positioning, and intelligent use of your abilities, and first and foremost, gunplay. While there is absolutely skill in outmaneuvering active supers or playing around super uptime, supers in general are purposefully designed to be accessible power fantasies for all players, and that inherently creates asymmetry that we need to account for in more competitive play. Primary weapon play should have a noticeable benefit in super energy regeneration. With this new system, we are scaling energy gains up and down granularly based on the source of the damage, both outgoing and incoming. Outgoing primary weapon damage has a significantly higher return of super energy per damage point than any other type of damage. Different supers should come online at different times in a given match, and your super of choice should have an impact on how quickly it regenerates. To reiterate what we mentioned above, we have always lived in a world where nearly every super in-game shares the same cooldown, regardless of their efficacy in a given game mode. Now that we have made the foundational change to differentiate cooldowns per individual ability, we want to address the super o'clock issue in the Crucible, where 3 minutes into a match, 12 supers are simultaneously popped and chaos ensues. We also want to open up build crafting space where your super's cooldown time is an important element in your decision making beyond how high you want your intellect stat to be. To that end, we've separated supers into cooldown tiers that affect both the passive regeneration rate as well as the damage based on regeneration rate. This tiering was primarily influenced by each super's kill potential, where most one-off supers are unlikely to wipe a team or a room of combatants, but a long-lasting roaming super can and should have a trade-off as a result. For example, later on we'll discuss Shadow Dive and changes we're making which impact how effective the Revenant Hunter is in the neutral game, causing us to shift some of that potency to the super's uptime as a result. It's also important to stress that this is the first iteration of the system, where any given super will fall into the recharge rate tiers will change over time as we continue tuning. These are the super regeneration rate tiers that we are launching with on December 7th. The fastest regeneration, Tier 5, the Well of Radiance. Tier 4, Blade Barrage and Silence and Squall. Tier 3, Shadow Shot, Burning Maul, Arc Staff, Nova Bomb, Thunder Crash. Tier 2, Golden Gun, Chaos Reach, Nova Warp, Storm Trance, Daybreak, Sentinel Shield, and Tier 1 with the slowest regeneration, Spectral Blades, Fist of Havoc, Hammer of Soul, Glacial Cloak, and Winter's Wrath. As Kevin and Eric mentioned, this sets up the future as we move towards Subclass 3.0. As an example, for the 30th anniversary, things like Deadfall and Mobius Quiver variants of Shadow Shot will share the same cooldown tier, but with the Void 3.0 launch in February, they could exist in different tiers based on their potency. By that same token, Ward of Dawn, which is currently tied to Sentinel Shield's cooldown, will be moved into the Tier 5 group as a standalone super with Void 3.0. Taking it down a notch, let's talk about non-super abilities for a moment. In the 527 TWAB, Kevin shared our foundational pillars for the role we want abilities to play in the PvP combat sandbox. As a quick refresher, this is where we want to be. Weapons as the primary ways players engage with combat. Non-super abilities accentuate or augment the combat, but should rarely solve an encounter by themselves. Abilities have clear strengths, weaknesses, and counterplay. Build crafting is rewarded within the moment-to-moment combat loop of Destiny. We're not there yet. In general, ability uptime in the Crucible is too high for their current potency, and it's difficult to understand when an opponent will regain an ability after using it. Some of the uptime comes from passive cooldowns, but many of our outliers also come from elements of the buildcraft system that have previously been unified in ability energy returns between PvE and PvP. With the 30th anniversary, we've taken a pass at a significant number of these elements across subclass perks, armor mods, and exotic armor pieces. We have tuned PvP energy regeneration separately from their PvE-based values, which we are not changing. Per our pillars, we want build crafting to be rewarding, but in its current state, the combinational nature of these perks and items leads to an unsustainable ability energy economy that diminishes weapon play in PvP. For this tuning pass, we focus primarily on items that feed into self-perpetuating loops of ability energy gains. Here's a brief list of the affected items. Subclass neutral game perks. These perks have had their ability energy regeneration reduced by roughly half in PvP. We have targeted perks that can either activate out of combat with a single button press, or those that were returning amounts of ability energy that were significantly out of band. The Whisper of Shards, Arc Web, Rising Storm, Ionic Traces, Electrostatic Surge, Aftershocks, Inertia Override, Benevolent Dawn, Practice Makes Perfect, and Dark Matter. Subclass and Super Perks. These perks scale down energy returns as you get kills in your super, i.e. the first kill while in super returns more super energy than the third kill. These perks often result in supers being able to roam the map for much longer than is healthy for the game and mean that a victim can frequently die to an active super, respawn on the other side of the map, and be killed by that same super again. We rescaled the energy refund decay more aggressively in PvP so that the minimum energy refund is reached roughly twice as quickly. No change has been made to refund decay against PvE combatants. Each exec below had a custom tuning pass focused on their energy return in PvP. Frosties no longer stacks multiplicatively in PvP with other buffs, it is now an additive scalar. Heart of Inmost Light. Ability scalars reduced by half. Rework so activating multiple abilities will now reliably result in empowered stacks. The stacking behavior was previously a bug, but this seemed like a good opportunity to promote it as a feature. Controverse holds. Duration of the grenade regeneration buff is no longer random between 1 and 4 seconds and is now a fixed duration at 1.75. Reduce grenade energy regeneration scalar by half. The previous average duration due to weighting was 171, with a 1 second duration being most common, so this should improve the exotic's consistency across the game with a lower return in PvP. Doomfang. Reduced the energy gain on activation when an opposing player is killed by void melee by 50%. Shinobu's Vow. Reduced grenade energy gain on hits versus players by 66%. Crown of Tempest. Grenade melee and super energy regeneration scalar buff reduced from 7 to 4 seconds. Stag. Reduced class ability energy refund on shield break by 50%. Armor mods. In general, we've reduced energy returns from these mods by roughly half. Melee kickstart. Grenade. Utility kickstart. Perpetuation. Bolstering detonation. Focusing strike. Bomber, Outreach, Dynamo, Distribution, Momentum Transfer, Impact Induction. This is a big foundational shift for us, and we expect to do a lot of tuning as time goes on, so as always, we'll be on the lookout for how things are feeling across the game and will adjust accordingly. Stasis Crystals do a lot. On top of freezing players when they're created, they also block line of sight, block movement, and act as explosive barrels. It's all a bit too much for PvP. With this release, Stasis Crystals will now slow players only instead of freezing them, and they'll do much less damage to players when they detonate. As far as PvE is concerned, Stasis Crystals will still freeze combatants, and we've increased Stasis Crystal detonation damage versus PvE combatants. As far as PvE is concerned, Stasis Crystals will still freeze combatants, and we've increased Stasis Crystal detonation damage versus those combatants. Looking at the numbers, it was almost always better to shoot directly at the combatant instead of at a crystal near it. This change should help crystals better live out their explosive barrel dreams. While forming, Stasis Crystals now slow nearby enemies instead of freezing them, still freeze PvE enemies. Increase slow freeze radius while forming from 1.75 to 2.6. Reduce crystal detonation damage versus players by 55%. Increase crystal detonation damage versus PvE combatants by 60%. Increase crystal detonation radius from 6 to 8 meters. The Hunter nerfs, changes. In order to meet our goal of less ability spam in the Crucible, we're reducing how often Hunters can dodge. Gambler's Dodge is getting hit the hardest here because it can completely circumvent melee ability cooldown times. It also completely changes the Hunter's silhouette in PvP, making it very powerful. In addition, Hunter Dodges will no longer break projectile tracking, meaning it's less of a get-out-of-jail-free card when a tracking rocket or another slow-moving projectile is flying towards you. Marksman Dodge. Tier 10 mobility cooldown increased from 11 seconds to 14. Base cooldown unchanged at 29 seconds. Gambler's Dodge. Tier 10 mobility cooldown increased from 11 seconds to 18. Base cooldown duration from 29 to 38. You guessed it. The Stasis Crystal changes detailed earlier mean that the Hunter Revenant's Shatter Dive will now almost never kill a full health Guardian. Shatter Dive may still kill if a Hunter is using Whisper of Fissures, Touch of Winter, and the target is in the very center of all 6 crystals, but that has been incredibly rare in our playtesting. I think we can all agree that Shatter Dive was too powerful. We tried a number of fixes over the past few releases, but the truth is that as long as Stasis Crystal froze players and Shatter Dive shattered players, it was going to be too good. But it's not all rain clouds and puddles for Shatter Dive Hunters. The increase in Stasis Crystal damage versus PvE combatants makes Shatter Dive a great choice in PvE. On top of that, we're increasing Shatter Dive damage versus frozen combatants by 100%. Have fun melting monsters. Shatter Dive changes. Much less lethal versus players due to Stasis Crystal changes. Much more lethal versus combatants due to Stasis Crystal changes. Increase shatter damage versus PvE combatants by 100%. And increase the fragment slots of Grim Harvest from 2 to 3. That's actually a really nice change. Top Street Arcstrider. Reduce the cooldown base duration from 96 to 15 seconds on Combination Blow. This is because Combination Blow was tied to using the dodge, so they're giving you a massive reduction to that melee based on how that mechanic was used. Vanish and Smoke melee has a low damage output but high utility. Our data shows that the subclass tree is struggling in PvP, so we've decided to increase how often Pathfinder hunters can go invisible, reduce the base cooldown of Vanish and Smoke from 96 to 75. Titan shoulder charges. In an effort to put the emphasis back on gunplay in the Crucible, we decided to reduce the number of abilities that can one-shot a full health Guardian. As such, the Titan's 3 shoulder charges are no longer one-shot abilities. To balance this, we made the shoulder charge quicker to activate, easier to hit with, and travel farther. We've also increased their damage in PvE. In our experience, they are still powerful in PvP in combination with short-range weapons and when used as a movement tool. We want to curb shoulder charge potency now that we've tuned down shotguns as their current counter. We'll be monitoring the data and feedback and adjusting accordingly. So all shoulder charges, no longer one-shots, sprint activation reduced from 1.5 to 1.25, increased range from 5.5 meters to 6.8 meters, targeting cone increased, and increased damage versus PvE monsters. So reduce the damage from 90 to 40 on the AoE, now blinds the enemy in the area on hit, that's cool. Increase base cooldown from 82 to 90 seconds. Avoid shield on bottom tree, reduced AoE damage, increased base cooldown. Top tree fire, reduced direct impact from 170 to 120, increased base cooldown. Barricade, increased base cooldown duration from 37 to 40 for the towering. The rallying barricade reduced base cooldown duration from 37 to 32. Behemoth increased fragment slots from 1 to 3. Now spawns Diamond Lance upon killing a PvE combatant with a stasis weapon, killing 3 players with a stasis weapon in a single life. That is an interesting mechanic because I think this is the first iteration where it's no longer a specific time, like something like Kill Clip or Rampage or Frenzy or something like that, where you have a time window, but it's a full-on life window buff. That's something that hasn't been explored, and I'm interested to see what else they could do with that. Killing any enemy with a stasis ability, shattering an ability. Shiver Strike, increased Shiver Strike damage while in Glacial Quake by 50%. Increased damage resistance versus PvE combatants from 25 to 40% with Whisper of Change. Bottom Tree Striker. Class is absolutely dominating PvP this season, so we're tuning it down a notch. The changes we made to Fist of Havoc in Season of the Lost helped Top Tree as intended, but they also turned Bottom Tree into a monster. Top of that, the Stasis nerfs and other changes we made over the past few releases created a power vacuum that Striker Bot filled with extreme prejudice. We hope these changes put Striker Bot back into pack instead of towering high above everything else. Knockout. Melee lunge range and melee damage bonuses now deactivate after a melee kill. Trample. Super energy gains from Fist of Havoc light attack now decays to a minimum amount over 3 PvP kills. Increase base cooldown of Frontal Assault from 82 to 106. Heavy Slam radius reduced from 8 meters to 6 meters for Bottom Tree. Warlock. Warlocks have been losing slap fights for too long. Yes, up until now, Warlocks haven't been able to melee back-to-back as quickly as Titans and Hunters. No more. The 30th anniversary, Warlocks will be able to melee just as quickly as Titans and Hunters. We're also removing the 1 meter range extension Warlocks received to compensate. We still think the idea of each class having unique qualities to their melee is interesting, but we want to do it in a way that won't cause one class to consistently lose slap fights. Maybe someday in the future. Uncharged melee. Reduce melee range from 5.5 to 4.5 now matches the other classes. Reduced suppression time after melee can now match the other classes. In an effort to do away with one-shot abilities that are frustrating to be hit by, Handheld Supernova is also getting the shoulder charge treatment. That's right, Handheld Supernova will no longer one-shot in PvP to compensate and now travels farther and pushes enemies back. We've also increased the damage of Handheld Supernova and Nova Warp versus champions and boss combatants. We have increased their damage in Season of the Lost, but it felt like they could use even more juice. Handheld Supernova reduced damage versus players, now deals 150 damage max. Increased damage versus champions by 30%. Increases range from 12 to 14. Now pushes targets away from the Warlock on detonation. Increased damage versus champions and bosses by 30%. Shadebinder changes. We feel that Shadebinder is in a pretty good place with a couple of exceptions. One, Witch's Wrath is still the best super for shutting down other supers, and it's not even close. Witch's Wrath must now freeze and shatter other supers twice to kill them. As a general rule, roaming supers shouldn't be able to one-shot other supers. 2, the Penumbral Blast melee is too difficult to land against PvE combatants. When we made the ability harder to land in PvP, it had a negative effect on PvE experience. We increased the proximity detonation radius against PvE combatants to make it easier to land. All 3 stasis grenades now have a different cooldown times, so we made the change to Bleak Watcher to avoid a situation where it was always best to use the grenade with the shortest cooldown time. This results in an overall cooldown increase for Bleak Watcher, which fits its incredibly high power output. Reduce shatter pulse damage versus enemy supers. Must now generally freeze and shatter all supers twice to eliminate. Increase proximity detonation radius for versus PvE combatants by 100%. While Bleak Watcher is equipped, all stasis grenades charge at Glacier Grenade rate. So yeah, those are the changes. A lot of interesting things in there. I'm interested to see what the community response will be to all of these. For the most part, I think everything is pretty positive. There are some things that I don't agree with in here, but I'm not going to share my opinions in this video just because it's going to be far too long. But I will be making individual videos for each of the class changes, and I'll share my deeper thoughts on the overall change to the sandbox. For the most part, I think these changes are positive, especially with the focus on bringing us back to weapon play, but I think they overlook the overall problem when it comes to build crafting, so I'll go more into that in my next set of videos. But let me know what you guys think about all these changes. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think you're going to be excited for these things? Are you going to be taking a break from Destiny until they really balance these out? Let me know, and I will see you in the next one.